Joining me now is Oklahoma Republican Congressman Tom Cole. Before he was elected to Congress, he worked as a pollster and a political consultant. He's a former chairman of the National Republican Campaign Committee. Basically, he thinks like a consultant sometimes who just happens to be an elected official, too. I'm teasing you there. Congressman, good to see you.
Fair enough.
Let me start with let me start with this election interference bill. Why is this so hard? Let's set aside what the president said. Why can't you guys vote in a bipartisan way to criminalize foreign interference in elections?
I think we can. I think we should. Look, this is a no-brainer to me. Look, somebody calls you up from a foreign government offering you information or help in your campaign. It's illegal. You should immediately call the appropriate law enforcement people, normally the FBI, since it would involve a foreign government. And look, that's what I would do, confronted with a case like this. We ought to be able to pass something like this. I don't sit on the relevant committees of jurisdiction, but as long as it wasn't a got-you piece of legislation, but a serious effort to make clear the guidelines that, frankly, the FEC commission, chairman of the FEC commission laid out. Look, this is illegal. You don't do it. I'd be happy to support something like that. It's just wrong. And so hopefully that's something Congress can get together on.
Look, I buy the fact that you would be in on this if it happened, but there doesn't seem to be political fallout on your side of the aisle over what the president said. Is it fair to say, fair or not, that he has conditioned the Republican base that this isn't that serious?
I don't think so. Actually, the fact that the president basically backtracked and took a different position, I'm glad he did, by the way, within 48 hours suggests to me that they did understand that this was a mistake and the president misspoke, or you can put it however you want. But at the end of the day, you can't be for allowing foreign powers to participate in American elections. I'm glad that the president came around to that. I would also say this, though, by the way. I think if you're law enforcement and you have some evidence that they are, you owe it to the campaigns to contact them and tell them that. That didn't happen in the president's case in 2016. That's a mistake. If the FBI or anybody think a foreign country is trying to penetrate a campaign, I think the campaign deserves a call from them to say, hey, we've picked this up. Something may be happening here. We want you to be extra alert.
You know what? Isn't that what the amendment process is for, Congress? I mean, this is what I don't get. Like, this is something that has, if you look at polling, bipartisan support. Have an amendment in there that would force the FBI to do this. This is what I don't understand is it seems as if, particularly on the Senate side, there is no interest in even trying to do this.
Well, again, I can't comment on the Senate side. I would be happy to work on an effort on the House side with somebody. Again, I'm not on the relevant committee of jurisdiction, and you know how this place works. You really need to be to actually do something. But I'd be happy to sit down and work with people from a political consultant standpoint, having been one for many years, about what we should do, how we should do it, and frankly, what law enforcement should do. Look, we were confronted with something pretty unprecedented in 2016, so I'm not pointing fingers at anybody anywhere. But we know a lot more now, because of the Mueller investigation, which has been very helpful. I wish we had more focus on what he said in the first part of the investigation about Russian involvement. And so we should act on that. We should take that part of it where I think you can have bipartisan agreement and say, okay, these are the rules of the road. These are the things the law enforcement should do. They should alert the campaigns. These are the things the campaign should do. We had a lot of people, frankly, that I think particularly in the Trump campaign, had never been in campaigns before, didn't know much about them, and I think he sort of stumbled into some difficult situations. Let's clarify that. If we need to do it legally, I am happy to help do that.
Well, you have a Homeland Security Secretary that wanted to convene a cabinet meeting on it, and apparently the president didn't want it.
Well, I regret that because we should have that. Look, this is a question of protecting our own political institutions and processes. I actually don't believe a foreign power can manipulate a presidential election. I believe they've tried. They have tried, by the way, ever since the 1790s with Citizen Genet and the French. So that's not new, and nobody's succeeded at it. And frankly, it becomes a bad thing for you, I think. And I think the president reacts a little bit to that. He worries about about it will color or undermine the legitimacy of his election. I don't think it does. But again, let's be crystal clear on this. This is something all Americans, regardless of where you are, ought to be able to unite around, ought to be able to work on together, and we ought to be able to send a really united message to anybody outside our borders. Don't come mess with our elections.
You know, most Fridays we're at a crescendo of some controversial thing the president said or did or threatened. Last Friday, it was the tariff threat at the border having to do with Mexico, and this sort of moment where there was a threat that it was going to happen. They were insisting it was going to happen, and we pulled back from the brink, and I think economically a whole bunch of people, particularly in your region, is happy about that. But this sort of threat to the border, pull it back, threat to the border, pull it back, what has that done to your district? What has that done to the communities there that frankly are being impacted a little bit more by all this?
Well, frankly, there is a real threat to the border. I mean, last month we picked up 144,000 people, including 10,000 unaccompanied minors that had entered the country illegally. In my district, in 2014,
they're being put into your district, right?
Absolutely.
Being,
in 2000,
yeah.
This is not our first rodeo here, by the way. In 2014, President Obama faced the same crisis, and Fort Sill in my district was tapped as one of the places that these unaccompanied minors would be housed. That's happened again. At least we don't have them yet. We don't have a timetable, but we've been told this may be necessary, and Fort Sill is on the list. So again, we handled this before. We can handle it again. But the real problem is, what do you do about the border and the immigration issue? And I think, look, you harden the border, number one. You change the laws, which I think Congress has been incapable of doing, and you obviously provide the relief. One of the things that concerns me the most about this, Chuck, Democrats so far haven't been willing to vote the money that the president needs to take care of these unaccompanied minors. We did that for President Obama when we were in the majority. They should do that for President Trump. I mean, this is not a partisan issue. We're legally required to take care of these unaccompanied minors. We should.
Given the way, though, the president has gone back on these threats with the tariffs and using economic pain, perhaps, to try to deal with this immigration, is he making it harder for Democrats to come to the table?
Well, they haven't come to the table, period. I mean, that's their fault. Look, this is here. They spent the first, we've had over 100,000 a month legal entries for 3 months. They spent the first 6 weeks telling us there wasn't a crisis at the border. It was all manufactured. Now it's a crisis at the border because President Trump has said he's actually going to enforce the border laws, so more people are coming so they can get in ahead of him being able to do that. What's that say about their commitment to helping? I mean, number one, we should put more money and resources here. We made some progress last year. We got to do a lot more. And I think the president is frustrated with Congress and is trying to do that. Number two, we have to seriously look at the laws. With all due respect, some of my colleagues on the other side really are for open borders. I mean, if you're for getting rid of the ICE for, immigration custom enforcement, then that means you really want to let the borders open to human trafficking, to drug problems, and to illegal entry. And I don't think the American people are there. I actually don't think most Democrats are there. They've got to get past not liking President Trump and sit down and bargain with President Trump.
Put your pollster hat on for me. There's been this theory. The president's approval rating basically sits in the mid-40s, okay? It can fluctuate 2 or 3 points north or south of that. The unemployment rate's below 4. Do you believe would he be in worse shape in a worse economy? Would he be in better shape if he didn't step on his own toes all the time? What's your theory of the case?
Both those things are true.
Here?
I mean, he'd be in worse shape if we have a worse economy. He'd be in much better shape if he were a more conventional, presidential type candidate. Now, to be fair to the president, I think he won because he was unconventional, and I don't think he's changed very much over the last 3 years. That's why he's kept his base. But I do think we need to reach out to people.
Are you concerned he's not?
From this economy?
Are you concerned he's not reaching out and trying to do something? You looked at these polls this week. Trump's at 42 against everybody, right? That's the best he can do. That's not a winning number even unless you get 6 more candidates in the general election.
It's not a winning number until they actually pick one. Look, right now nobody's waged a campaign against any of the Democratic frontrunners. I can assure you that will happen. They'll start it themselves. It'll continue in a general election. So I think this thing gets more competitive. But look, a more traditional outreach, and I tell this to my friends at the White House, the administration. You got to think about not who you have, but who have you added. And we have the ability to add a lot of people, given the state of the economy, given the success of rebuilding the military, given deregulation. He's kept a lot of his commitments, the movement of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Let's talk about the positive things we've done, not pick a fight every day. I think, if we saw more speeches like we saw in Normandy, I think the president's numbers would go up.
Well, as I said, I think he's hoping, he wants to make it a referendum on his record, not his character. So we will see what happens on that front. Congressman Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, longtime political pollster as well. Good to see you. Thanks for coming on and sharing your views.
Chuck, thanks for having me.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.